No one in that immigration line thought they were about to witness something unusual. It was just another morning. Tired passengers, rolling suitcases, stamped passports, routine questions, and a quiet man in a black cap standing patiently like everyone else. He wasn't in first class, no security detail, no VIP escort, just waiting his turn. When he finally stepped forward, the officer barely looked up. Purpose of visit? Work, the man replied calmly. The officer flipped through the passport, paused, then looked at him again. His expression shifted. Not recognition, judgment. You people always say that. The tone wasn't neutral. It wasn't procedural. It was personal. A second officer leaned over. What kind of work? Film production meetings. The first officer smirked. Oh, an actor? A short laugh followed. Passengers nearby started to sense something uncomfortable. The questions continued, slowly, deliberately. Do you expect special treatment here? Think the rules don't apply to you? The man didn't react. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't correct them. Didn't say the one sentence most celebrities would. He just stood there, calm, still, patient. And that calmness seemed to irritate them even more. One of the officers placed the passport aside, intentionally, delaying the process, stepped to the side. The words echoed louder than necessary. The line behind him shifted. A woman whispered, "Isn't that?" Phone subtly lifted, but he didn't move with anger. He moved with composure. Here's the strange part. He could have ended it in seconds. One sentence would have changed the tone instantly, but he didn't say it. Not yet. Because what the officers didn't realize was that the quiet man they were trying to humble didn't need to prove who he was, and in exactly 9 minutes, the room would understand why. But before we go further, if you were standing there, would you have reacted immediately or stayed silent? Let's see what happened next. Airports are designed to remove identity. It doesn't matter who you are outside those walls. Inside immigration, everyone becomes the same thing, a passport, a purpose, a process. At least that's how it's supposed to work. The man standing there wasn't dressed like a global celebrity. No tailored suit, no sunglasses hiding behind fame. Just a worn travel jacket and the quiet posture of someone used to waiting. To the world, he was Keanu Reeves. But in that moment, to the officers, he was just another traveler they believed needed to be put in place. And sometimes, power isn't loud. Sometimes it hides behind procedure. The first officer flipped through the passport again. Slowly. Too slowly. Length of stay? 3 days. Where are you staying? He answered clearly. Directly. No hesitation. The second officer leaned back in his chair. You actors fly around the world and think everything is automatic. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't aggressive. But it wasn't neutral either. It carried assumption. Bias. A subtle attempt at shrinking someone. Passengers behind him shifted uncomfortably. The line had stopped moving. One man glanced at his watch. Woman tilted her head slightly, trying to confirm if she recognized the face under the cap. And still, no reaction, no ego, no irritation. That's when the first officer asked something unnecessary. Why didn't you request VIP clearance? The question didn't make procedural sense. Because immigration clearance doesn't depend on celebrity, status. It was bait. The kind of question meant to trigger arrogance, but he didn't take it. I didn't need it. Simple answer. Calm tone. And that calmness began to change the dynamic. Because when someone refuses to escalate, the person trying to provoke often feels exposed. The second officer tapped the desk lightly. You understand we can send you to secondary inspection if we feel like it. There it was. The power flex, not based on suspicion, not based on documentation, just on mood. Now pause for a second. If you were standing there, would you defend yourself? Would you demand a supervisor, or would you stay composed and let the moment unfold? Because here's what most people miss. True authority doesn't rush to defend itself. It waits. The passport was placed aside again, another unnecessary delay. The atmosphere around the counter thickened. The officers believed they were controlling the interaction. What they didn't realize was something much bigger was quietly in motion. And they were about to learn something important. Professionalism isn't tested when dealing with ordinary situations. It's tested when ego gets involved. And ego was very involved now. What happened next didn't begin with shouting. It began with someone noticing. And that small shift changed everything. The delay stretched longer than necessary. 5 minutes in an airport line can feel like nothing. But 5 minutes under silent scrutiny feels different. The officers had stopped pretending it was routine. Now it felt deliberate. The first officer leaned back in his chair, studying him in a way that wasn't procedural. It was personal. "You've been here before?" "Yes." "How many times?" "A few." "How many is a few?" The questions weren't about documentation anymore. They were about dominance. Passengers behind him began shifting more noticeably now. The line wasn't moving. A man in a business suit stepped sideways to look at the counter. A teenage boy whispered to his mother, "I think isn't that him?" The mother squinted. Phones started appearing, subtle at first. The second officer noticed the attention and straightened slightly. Instead of easing the situation, he doubled down. "Remove your cap." The request wasn't illegal, but it was unnecessary. Still, he removed it calmly. No resistance, no attitude. The officer looked at his face closely. Recognition flickered for half a second, then pride overrode it. "So you are an actor?" Not a question, a statement. There was something in the tone, not admiration, challenge. "You think because people know your face we treat you differently?" He shook his head gently. "I didn't ask for that." That answer landed heavier than any argument could have. Because it was true. He hadn't asked for special treatment. He hadn't mentioned his name. He hadn't tried to use influence. And yet the tension kept rising. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes when someone remains calm, in the face of disrespect, it exposes the insecurity of the person trying to dominate. The first officer glanced around, noticing more eyes watching. Instead of de-escalating, he chose authority. Secondary inspection. He stamped a small red mark on a form, louder than necessary. A signal. Public. Intentional. The air shifted, instantly. Secondary inspection implies suspicion, and suspicion implies doubt. The line behind him grew restless. A businessman muttered, "This is ridiculous." The teenage boy was now openly recording, and that's when something subtle changed in the officer's posture. They realized this interaction was no longer private. It had an audience, and audiences change power dynamics. Pause here. Let me ask you something honestly. Do you think this was procedure or ego? Because there's a difference. Procedure is consistent. Ego reacts. The officers were no longer just processing a traveler. They were defending pride. He stepped slightly to the side as instructed, still calm, still silent. No visible frustration. No, "Do you know who I am?" And that silence began doing something unexpected. It shifted sympathy. Passengers weren't seeing a celebrity anymore. They were seeing a man being unnecessarily challenged, and public sympathy is powerful. One woman in line finally spoke softly to another officer nearby. "Is this necessary?" That question floated across the counter, small but sharp. The second officer stiffened. "It's under review, ma'am." Short, dismissive. But now the energy in the room had changed. This wasn't authority anymore. It was pressure. And pressure reveals cracks. That's when footsteps approached from the left side of the terminal. Not rushing, not dramatic, just steady. A floor operations supervisor doing his routine walkthrough. He wasn't looking for conflict. He wasn't expecting a scene. He was simply passing by. Until he noticed something unusual. A small crowd, forming at an immigration counter. Phones raised. Whispers spreading. He slowed down, looked toward the counter, then looked again. Because recognition doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrives as a pause. And in that pause, everything shifts. The supervisor didn't react publicly. He didn't announce anything, but he adjusted his path, turned slightly, and started walking toward the counter. The officers hadn't noticed yet. They were too focused on maintaining control. But within seconds, control was about to move. Not because of fame, not because of ego, but because someone higher in the chain had just recognized a situation escalating unnecessarily. And what happened next didn't require shouting. It required awareness. The supervisor didn't rush. He didn't interrupt loudly. He simply observed. From a distance first. A forming crowd, raised phones, an immigration counter that wasn't moving. That alone was unusual. Then he looked at the man standing calmly, to the side. Cap removed now. Face visible. Recognition hit. Not dramatic, but immediate. He had seen that face before. Not on a movie poster. In a boardroom. And that detail mattered more. He approached the counter carefully. "Is there an issue here?" The first officer responded quickly. "Routine secondary inspection." Short, confident, defensive. The supervisor's eyes moved to the passport, resting on the desk. "May I?" The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then handed it over. The supervisor opened it, read the name, looked up slowly, then looked back at the officer. Silence. Not angry silence, measured silence. Here's what most of the terminal didn't know. 3 months earlier, the airport had entered a private expansion agreement, a major film production partnership. The goal was to turn this location into a regional production hub, jobs, tourism, international press. The funding structure wasn't public knowledge, but senior operations had been briefed, and one of the private investors involved in that expansion was the man now standing quietly at secondary inspection, not acting as a celebrity, not acting as a producer, just traveling. Still, he hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't used it. He hadn't even hinted at it. The supervisor closed the passport, looked at the officers again. "Step aside for a moment." The tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't optional. The officers felt it immediately. Authority had shifted. The crowd felt it too. Energy in. The room changed. The first officer attempted to justify. "We're just following protocol." The supervisor nodded calmly. "Of course, I understand." But his eyes said something else. Protocol is consistent. This hadn't felt consistent. He turned slightly toward the quiet traveler. "Sir, I apologize for the delay." And that sentence changed everything. Because apology implies imbalance. Now pause here. Think about this carefully. If the man had introduced himself loudly at the beginning, would the situation have unfolded differently? Probably. But something more important was happening here. The reveal wasn't coming from him. It was coming from the system, and that makes it stronger. The supervisor stepped to the side with the officers, not far enough to be secretive, but far enough to speak privately. Voices lowered, body language shifted. The second officer's posture tightened, confidence fading. Because now the situation wasn't about controlling a traveler, it was about explaining behavior. The supervisor spoke quietly but firmly. Was there documentation issue? No. Suspicion of entry violation? No. Then why secondary? Silence. That silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough. Long enough for doubt to form, long enough for reality to settle in. Behind them, passengers were still watching, phones still raised. And here's something important. This wasn't about celebrity protection. This was about visible bias under public recording. Airports operate under strict compliance standards. Any sign of discriminatory tone or unnecessary delay under observation becomes a risk, a liability, and liability moves faster than ego. The supervisor requested internal review on his device. Not dramatic, just procedural. And when procedure is activated properly, it doesn't need emotion. It just needs documentation. The officers now understood something. The power they tried to assert moments ago was no longer in their hands. It had moved upward, quietly, calmly. The supervisor returned the passport, stamped it, cleared entry. He looked directly at the traveler. "You're good to go, sir." No spectacle, no humiliation, just restoration of balance. But this wasn't the end, because actions inside controlled environments don't disappear. They get reviewed, and within minutes, another system was triggered, one that the officers hadn't considered. And that's when the real consequence began. The stamp hit the passport with a soft but definitive sound. Entry approved. Simple, clean, professional. The supervisor handed it back with both hands. "Apologies for the inconvenience." The man nodded. "Once. No problem." And that could have been the end. He could have walked away. The officers could have resumed processing the next passenger. The moment could have dissolved into routine airport noise, but something had already shifted. Because when authority steps in publicly, it leaves a trail. The supervisor didn't return to his patrol. He stepped slightly aside and opened his internal device again. A short compliance report. Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual. Time of delay. Reason cited. Public crowd formation. Body cam reference. That's how modern systems work. They don't rely on anger. They rely on records. Behind the counter, the two officers felt the atmosphere changing. Not from the crowd, from above. The first officer tried to normalize his posture, straightened papers, adjusted his chair. The second avoided eye contact. Because now it wasn't about control, it was about accountability. Let's pause here. Many people assume power looks loud, explosive, dominating. But real power is often procedural. It moves quietly, and once it moves, it's difficult to stop. The supervisor made a brief call. Short, calm internal compliance division. Words like review and public optics were used. Not once did anyone say the word celebrity. Because that wasn't the issue. The issue was conduct under observation, and airports, especially international hubs, take that seriously. Within minutes, a senior shift manager arrived. The crowd had begun to disperse slightly, but the energy remained. Phones still recording, passengers whispering. The shift manager spoke directly to the supervisor. Low voice, focused. He then asked the officers for their identification badges. That's when reality settled in. Not termination. Not yet. But temporary suspension pending review. Access badges deactivated, standard protocol during investigation. 9 minutes earlier, they were in control of the counter. Now they were stepping away from it. Silently. Without argument. Because arguing would only confirm the review. The first officer looked toward the man who had been delayed. For a second, pride almost pushed him to speak. But he didn't. The second officer avoided looking at him at all, and here's the part most people misunderstand. The man at the center of this never demanded it. He never raised his voice. He never threatened. He never said, "I'll have your jobs." He didn't need to, because systems don't respond to ego. They respond to exposure. The supervisor approached him one final time. "Again, I apologize." He simply nodded. "I understand procedures." That sentence carried weight, because it acknowledged authority without challenging it. He adjusted his cap, picked up his bag, and began walking toward the exit corridor. No dramatic music, no slow-motion stare, just a quiet exit. But the lesson lingered, in the air. Passengers who had watched the interaction were already forming opinions. Some believed the officers were unfair. Some believed they were just doing their job poorly. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The situation escalated unnecessarily, and unnecessary escalation in professional environments has consequences. As he walked toward baggage claim, something else became clear. He had known he could have ended it earlier. One sentence, one introduction. Name drop, but he chose not to. Why? Because there's something powerful about allowing someone to reveal themselves. When given patience, people expose their own character. The officers had done exactly that. Now let me ask you something honestly. If he had introduced himself immediately, would the officers have behaved differently? Probably. But would that have corrected the underlying attitude? Probably not. And that's the difference between winning a moment and correcting a system. Within the hour, internal review footage would be examined, tone analyzed, body language evaluated, not emotionally, professionally. Because in high-visibility environments, perception matters. Not because a famous actor was involved, but because consistency matters. Respect isn't conditional. It doesn't adjust based on appearance, or fame, or lack of it. And when respect becomes selective, organizations respond. The officers weren't destroyed. They weren't publicly humiliated. They weren't dragged out dramatically. They were simply removed from duty pending review, quietly, systematically, the same way they had tried to assert authority earlier. Only this time, it wasn't ego-driven. It was policy-driven, and policy always moves higher than pride. As he exited the terminal, a few passengers who recognized him offered small nods. He nodded back. No speech, no interview, no social media post, just movement forward, because the real power in that moment wasn't in firing someone. It wasn't in revenge. It was in restraint, and restraint is often misunderstood. But it is rarely weak. And what happened afterward shifted the conversation from celebrity to something much deeper. By the time he reached baggage claim, the tension at the counter had already dissolved into procedure. But the story didn't disappear. It spread. Not because he posted about it. He didn't. Not because he gave an interview. He didn't. It spread because people recorded it. Because in today's world, moments don't stay contained. They travel. Clips began circulating online within hours. Short videos, different angles, whispers in the background. The moment the supervisor stepped in. Headlines, exaggerated of course. They picked the wrong guy. They had no idea who he was. Instant karma. But the people who were actually there described something different. Not revenge, not humiliation, restraint. And that's where the real story lives. Because this wasn't about celebrity power, it was about professionalism under pressure. Let's step back for a second. Immigration officers deal with thousands of travelers daily. Fatigue, stress, repetition. It's easy for tone to slip, easy for ego to sneak in. But that's exactly when professionalism matters most. Respect isn't tested when everything is smooth, it's tested when patience runs thin. Now here's the uncomfortable question. If that had been an unknown traveler instead of someone recognizable, would the supervisor have noticed as quickly? Would the crowd have reacted the same way? Would phones have been raised? Be honest with yourself. Because this is where the debate begins. Some people argued they were just doing their job. Others said, there's a difference between doing your job and asserting dominance. And that's the moral line this story walks. The officers weren't punished because of who he was. They were reviewed because of how they behaved. That distinction matters. A system that protects status but ignores behavior is broken. A system that reviews behavior consistently is stable. From what internal reports later suggested, the suspension wasn't permanent. It was investigational. Training protocols reviewed. Conduct guidelines reinforced. Public interaction standards clarified. In other words, correction, not destruction. And correction is powerful, because it doesn't just solve one incident, it prevents the next one. Meanwhile, he never addressed it publicly. No tweet, no statement. No, this is what happened to me. Silence again, and silence sometimes speaks louder than commentary, because when you don't capitalize on a moment of leverage, It reveals something about your character. He could have turned it into headlines. He didn't. He could have demanded public apology. He didn't. He simply moved on. And that's where this becomes bigger than one airport interaction. It becomes about identity, about how you carry yourself when someone tries to diminish you, about whether power needs to announce itself, or whether it can wait. Now let me ask you directly. Do you think silence in moments of disrespect is strength or weakness? Would you have spoken up immediately, or let the system correct itself? Comment honestly, because this is where people divide. Some believe respect must be demanded instantly. Others believe real authority doesn't rush. And neither answer is simple. But here's what is clear. The officers assumed they were in control because they held the stamp. But control, based on position, is temporary. Control based on composure is harder to shake. 9 minutes. That's all it took. 9 minutes for ego to rise. 9 minutes for awareness to shift. 9 minutes for authority to change hands, not through shouting, not through intimidation, but through exposure. And exposure is the quietest form of consequence. The story faded from headlines within days. Airports returned to routine. Travelers continued moving. But for those who witnessed it, one image remained clear: a man standing calmly while being underestimated, and a system correcting itself when someone finally looked closely. Sometimes the loudest statement is patience. By the end of that morning, the airport had returned to normal. Announcements echoed again. Lines moved forward, passports stamped, but something invisible had shifted. Not just at the counter, in perception. Because moments like that remind us of something simple. Power doesn't always belong to the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it belongs to the calmest. He never demanded recognition. He never raised his voice. He never tried to win. And yet, he walked away with dignity intact. So here's the real question. If you were in his position, would you have said, "Do you know who I am?" Or would you have let silence do the work? Be honest. Type one of these in the comments: immediate reaction or calm power. I genuinely want to see which side wins, and if this story made you think differently about respect, authority, and restraint, then you're going to want to watch the next one. Because sometimes, the people who look the most ordinary in line are the ones the world underestimates the most. And underestimation is often the beginning of revelation.